Chapter 20. The two dolls paused along the way and sat down to rest on a pair of knee-high wicker armchairs in some far region of the attic. Maggie leaned against the wall and waited, wondering how long it would take, at this rate, to reach the outdoors. What if they didn't get there until after dark? What if the garden were at the end of some tunnel whose mouth she would never find again? She shifted against the wall and looked around. A block of light came in from a high window, but there was little to see. A couple of chairs, a fluff of dust, a wall papered in a faded print. She was eager to move on, and her eyes searched for a doorway or turning that would take them on their way. At last, Timothy John stirred in his chair. "Well, now," he said, and Maggie straightened up. But he only leaned over to set Juniper's basket on the floor. "Well, now," he repeated and he raised the little scrap of newsprint to his face, studying it for a long while. "I see in the paper," he said carefully, "that there's been a fire. 2 lost in fire, it says." Miss Christabel turned to face him from her chair. "Pity," she said, and then, after a moment, 2 lost in fire. Read it to me, Timothy John." Timothy John turned the paper this way and that until it caught the light coming in from the high window. "Wash tub for sale," he began. "No, read about the fire." 2 lost in fire," he repeated. "That's in big letters. Fire broke out suddenly in the barn at—" "That's all there is," he apologized. Maggie looked over the torn newsprint and saw on one side an advertisement with a picture of an old-fashioned wash tub, and on the other the headline Timothy John had just read. At the top corner was a portion of a date, and Maggie leaned closer to read it. Wednesday, May 14th, 18-something. The rest was torn away. "Pity," Miss Christabel repeated. 2 lost in fire. 2 what, I wonder? "It doesn't say," Timothy John answered. "Gloves, maybe. Maybe somebody lost 2 gloves in the fire. Gloves come in 2s, and people are always losing them, even when there is no fire." "That could be. Wouldn't that be a shame, though? Imagine losing 2 gloves and not being able to find them in all that smoke. I hope they were from the same pair." Timothy John put the paper under his arm and began to rise. "Well," he said, and Maggie prepared to continue their trip to the garden, but he only moved Juniper's basket again, this time placing it in the square of light that lay on the floor like a white rug. Sit down a bit, Maggie," he said, settling back in the wicker chair. "You must be tired after all that walking." "When are we going to the garden?" she asked, not moving. Timothy John turned his smiling face up to her. "What?" he asked again. "The garden. When are we going there?" Miss Christabel turned in her chair. "We're not going there," she said. "But I thought you said that's where you were going," Maggie insisted, turning to Timothy John. "You even put on your hat and everything." "We can't be going to the garden," he answered, "when we are already there." Maggie stared at him. Already there? This was the garden? This? "It is especially lovely today," Timothy John went on, and he pushed his chair to the patch of light next to Juniper's basket. "The sun feels good on a day like this," he said, sitting down and putting his face to the thin white rays coming through the window. "The roses are especially nice, too," Miss Christabel said. "Maggie, turn your face to the roses. They will redden your cheek. See if they don't." "See if they do," Timothy John corrected. Maggie looked at both dolls. "What roses?" she asked, her voice louder than she expected. "All of them," Timothy John answered. "This one and this one and this one." He pointed his cane to the wall, and Maggie now saw, printed on its peeling paper, a tangle of faded flowers winding among the pale trellises. These were the roses? Wallpaper? She looked back at the dolls. "They need watering," Miss Christabel observed. "Maggie, give them a good sprinkling so they don't droop. And don't forget the little ones," Timothy John added, focusing his painted eyes on the papered wall. "Here's one that looks especially thirsty," and he touched his cane to a pattern near the floor molding where everything but a few traces of pink had rubbed away. Maggie looked at the wallpaper. "That's what you call a garden? You want me to water that?" "Of course," Miss Christabel replied, "before they wilt," and she turned to examine the papered wall. "I can't think what I would do without my roses," she remarked contentedly. "They brighten my life." "With what? What with?" Maggie asked. "With happiness," Miss Christabel answered. "What should I water them with?" "With water," and Miss Christabel held out the kettle. "And don't forget the little buds. Hurry," she urged, when Maggie still did not move. Maggie stared at both dolls. "That's dumb," she finally said. "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard, watering wallpaper." You may begin with these, Timothy John said, and he pointed his cane to the faded patch. Dumb, Maggie repeated. And anyway, she added, suddenly remembering something, you can't water the roses with that kettle. It's hot. It's got hot water in it. It's hot, remember? Timothy John stared at her. Maggie, he said patiently, that's the tea water you're thinking of. Here, there's rose water in the kettle now. There's nothing in the kettle now, Maggie answered back. See? She seized the kettle and held it upside down on the floor, over the floor. Hold it closer to the roots, Timothy John admonished her. The roots are the throat of the plant. Maggie lowered her arm. The roots are the throat of the plant. What a strange spectacle that made. Every stem ending underground in a soft pink gummy cavity, opening, closing, taking large draughts of water in steady, thirsty gulps and sending them where? Up instead of down? And in this case, up a papered wall, except there wasn't any water to gulp in the first place. She dropped the kettle to the floor. They don't have roots, she shouted. These aren't real roses. They're wallpaper. It's stupid to water wallpaper roses. And anyway, there's no water in this kettle, hot or cold. And there's no tea in that teapot either, and no sugar in the sugar bowl, and no milk in the pitcher. And that's not real bread. It's just pieces of wood. Her voice had risen even more. And you're just a couple of old dolls. She stopped. Both Timothy John and Miss Christabel rose from their chairs and were advancing towards her. Timothy John with his cane clutched in his hand. Maggie stepped back against the flowered wall and held her breath, feeling suddenly trapped in an attic room no one knew about by a pair of mechanical dolls, or whatever they were, who could, kill her maybe? With a twist of his jointed wrist, the man doll could hurl his cane at her if he chose, stabbing her to death. It could have poison in its tip, and all he would have to do was scratch it against her skin. She could die up here of blood poisoning or something, and no one would ever know. She's run away, Aunt Harriet would later decide after a day or two. It's not surprising, Aunt Lillian would reply. She never did belong here. She was a difficult child. Was, they would say. In a few days' time, they would clear out her room, never dreaming that her body lay only a few dozen yards away, crumpled alongside the peeling roses on a papered wall. The two dolls drew nearer, and Maggie's stomach grew watery. In the next moment, she swung her foot out and sent both dolls sprawling across the room, the garden, whatever it was. With their arms outstretched and their legs straightened behind them, they looked as though they were swimming in a pool, but Timothy John's head soon struck the far wall and his body slid down to the floor. And Miss Christabel sat down hard against the wicker chair. Both continued to smile, their red-painted smiles, Timothy John up at the ceiling, Miss Christabel across the room at Maggie. Just under the rubbed-out patch of flowers, Juniper lay upside down, the hole in his underside exposed to view. She crossed over to their bodies on tiptoe and bent down to look at them. A long crack, clean as wire, ran across Timothy John's forehead, and one of Miss Christabel's legs jutted out at a crazy angle from the hem of her skirt. Juniper was missing an ear. Maggie touched the man doll's body with the toe of her shoe, as though she were testing a dead bird, but he didn't stir. Neither doll did. Maybe she had broken them for good. Maybe she could pick them up now and hold them upside down. She could take them apart if she liked and see what was inside. Maybe she would find in the hollow of each body some tiny mechanism like the works of a music box that had made them talk and walk or purr like a cat. Timothy John's body shifted suddenly on the floor, and he began to speak. I think, he said, his eyes still on the ceiling, she is the wrong one after all. The wrong one, Miss Christabel repeated from the legs of the chair. It seems odd, though. She seemed so right. We will have to wait for another. It is a pity, Miss Christabel sighed. We waited so long. It might be decades before another one came. Her voice faded on the last word and ran down like a phonograph suddenly shut off. After that, neither doll spoke. I don't care, Maggie shouted into the stillness. I don't want to be the right one. You're just a couple of old dolls. She began edging away, retreating along the wall, along the narrow corridor, past the little room, around the wardrobe, and through the clusters of shrouded furniture in the attic until she reached the top of the stairs that would take her back to the empty room. I don't play with dolls, she cried back into the darkness. There came no answer. It wasn't until she had felt her way down to the bedroom of the bottom of the steps that she heard anything at all. The voices first of Aunt Lillian and then of Aunt Harriet. "Maggie, where are you?"